Zambia has officially signed the controversial IMF deal. But what was the price? While the government celebrates, Esther Lungu and Makebi Zulu have broken their silence, and their reaction will leave you speechless. Is this the economic breakthrough Zambia needed, or a trap disguised as progress? Stay tuned as we uncover what the IMF demanded and what Zambia might have truly lost. Breaking news: Zambia has signed a major IMF deal, but not everyone is celebrating. Former First Lady Esther Lungu and prominent lawyer Makebi Zulu have exposed what they claim the country gave up in return. Introduction: IMF deal signed. In August 2022, Zambia secured a 38-month extended credit facility (ECF) arrangement with the IMF for SDR 978.2 million, approximately $1.3 billion, later augmented in June 2024 to SDR 1,271.66 million, about $1.7 billion, to address additional challenges, particularly a severe drought. This deal marked a significant step for Zambia, Africa's second-largest copper producer, which had been grappling with debt distress, having defaulted on its Eurobonds in November 2020, the first African nation to do so during the COVID-19 pandemic. The agreement aims to support Zambia's 8th National Development Plan 2022 to 2026, focusing on restoring macroeconomic stability, achieving fiscal and debt sustainability, enhancing governance, and fostering inclusive growth to improve livelihoods, especially for vulnerable populations. IMF or CommonwealthLawyers.com. The deal followed years of economic mismanagement under previous administrations, particularly during the Patriotic Front (PF) government led by former President Edgar Lungu 2015 to 2021. Excessive borrowing for infrastructure projects, often from Chinese creditors, led to unsustainable debt levels, with external debt reaching $14.87 billion and domestic debt at ZMW 44 billion, about $2.5 billion by September 2022. The Hichilema administration, elected in August 2021, prioritized transparency and engaged the IMF to address these challenges, marking a shift from the PF's reluctance to adopt IMF-recommended reforms. ChathamHouse.org, Africa.com. ChathamHouse.org. The IMF program includes fiscal consolidation, debt restructuring under the G20 Common Framework, and structural reforms to improve governance and reduce corruption risks. Key milestones include a staff-level agreement on the fourth review in October 2024, providing Zambia with immediate access to $184 million, and a successful Eurobond restructuring in June 2024, with over 90% of bondholders approving the deal. Despite these achievements, Zambia faces significant challenges, including a historic drought that has reduced agricultural output by 20.6% and electricity generation by 9.6% in 2024, impacting economic growth, projected at 1.2% for the year. IMF. What the IMF promised Zambia. The IMF's commitments to Zambia under the ECF are multifaceted, aiming to address immediate economic challenges while fostering long-term stability. The key promises include financial support. The IMF initially committed $1.3 billion, augmented to $1.7 billion in June 2024, to address balance of payments needs and support Zambia's response to the drought. Disbursements include IMF.org, $185 million in August 2022 upon approval of the ECF. IMF.org, $187 million after the second review in December 2023. IMF.org, $569.6 million after the third review and augmentation in June 2024. IMF.org, $184 million after the fourth review in December 2024. IMF.org. These funds are split between budget support and rebuilding international reserves to enhance external resilience. The Tricontinental Org. Debt sustainability. The IMF supports Zambia's debt restructuring efforts under the G20 Common Framework, facilitating agreements with official creditors, e.g. China, France, South Africa, and private bondholders. The Eurobond restructuring, finalized in June 2024, provided significant debt service relief, aligning with IMF program parameters and the Official Creditor Committee's (OCC) comparability of treatment criteria. Zambia is expected to reach a moderate risk of external debt distress over the medium term. IMF.org. Fiscal and economic stabilization. The IMF program emphasizes fiscal consolidation to reduce the fiscal deficit from 6% of GDP in 2021 to a surplus of 3.2% by 2025. This involves Chelwa.blogspot.com, reducing inefficient public spending such as fuel and electricity subsidies, enhancing domestic revenue mobilization through improved tax administration and a broader tax base, protecting and increasing social spending to cushion vulnerable populations, including expanding the Social Cash Transfer (SCT) program and increasing health and education budgets. IMF.org. Structural reforms. The IMF supports governance and anti-corruption measures, including implementing the Public Debt Management Act 2022 and revising the Bank of Zambia Act 2022 to enhance central bank autonomy. CommonwealthLawyers.com. Rolling out the Integrated Financial Management Information System (IFMIS) to all 61 central government institutions to improve expenditure tracking mf.org. Introducing transparency measures such as new public procurement regulations and access to information laws, mf.org. ifex.org. Economic growth and diversification. The program aims to foster resilient, inclusive growth by supporting private sector development, energy sector reforms, and agricultural modernization. Growth is projected to recover to 6.2% in 2025, driven by mining and agricultural recovery, provided reforms continue, mf.org. However, these promises come with stringent conditions, raising concerns about their feasibility and social impact, as discussed below. Hidden costs, land, laws, and sovereignty. The IMF deal, while providing critical financial relief, imposes conditions that critics argue could undermine Zambia's sovereignty and exacerbate social inequalities. These hidden costs include land and resource implications. Agricultural reforms. The IMF's push to reform the Farmer Input Support Program, FISP, which supports small-scale farmers, involves reducing its funding from 3% of GDP in 2022 to 1% by 2025. FISP has been instrumental in achieving maize self-sufficiency, and critics, such as economist Grieve Chelwa, argue that these cuts could jeopardize food security and harm small-scale farmers, who form a significant portion of Zambia's rural population. The Tricontinental blogspot.com. Resource dependency. Zambia's reliance on copper exports makes it vulnerable to global commodity price volatility. The IMF's focus on mining sector recovery without sufficient emphasis on diversification could lock Zambia into a resource-dependent economy, limiting long-term sovereignty over its economic destiny. mf.org. Legal and policy reforms. Austerity measures. The IMF's demand for front-loaded and sustained fiscal consolidation includes reducing public expenditure, eliminating fuel and electricity subsidies, and increasing taxes, such as expanding the value-added tax (VAT) base. These measures could raise the cost of living, disproportionately affecting the poor. For example, electricity tariff increases mandated by December 2022 have strained households already facing drought-related economic pressures. The Tricontinental blogspot.com. Legislative changes. The Public Debt Management Act 2022 and revised Bank of Zambia Act 2022 aim to enhance fiscal credibility and central bank autonomy, but may limit government flexibility in responding to domestic needs. Critics argue these reforms align Zambia's policies with IMF priorities, potentially reducing national control over fiscal and monetary policy. Commonwealth lawyers. OMTE Tricontinental.org. Transparency versus control. While the IMF supports access to information laws, the opaque drafting of Zambia's new cyber laws and the Zambia Institute of Journalism Bill has raised concerns about potential restrictions on media freedom and public discourse, undermining democratic sovereignty. ifex.org. Sovereignty concerns. Neo-colonial dynamics. Critics like those at Tricontinental Institute for Social Research argue that IMF interventions in Africa, including Zambia, reinforce neo-colonial control by locking countries into cycles of debt and austerity. The G20 Common Framework, while facilitating debt restructuring, requires Zambia to align with creditor demands, potentially prioritizing foreign interests over domestic needs. The Tricontinental.org. Loss of policy autonomy. The IMF's conditions, such as subsidy cuts and fiscal targets, limit Zambia's ability to pursue independent economic policies. For instance, halting new capital expenditure on public goods like roads and power stations, as demanded by the IMF, could hinder infrastructure development critical for long-term growth. The Tricontinental.org. Debt trap risks. Although the IMF aims to restore debt sustainability, Zambia remains at high risk of debt distress in the near term. The reliance on external financing, including from the IMF and bilateral creditors like China, could perpetuate dependency if reforms fail to deliver inclusive growth. mf.org. These hidden costs highlight a tension between immediate financial relief and long-term national autonomy, prompting debates about whether the IMF deal serves Zambia's broader interests. Esther Lungu's emotional response. Esther Lungu, the former First Lady of Zambia and widow of former President Edgar Lungu, who passed away in June 2025, has not been directly quoted in the provided sources regarding her emotional response to the IMF deal specifically. However, the context of Edgar Lungu's death and the subsequent funeral dispute provides insight into the emotional and political climate surrounding the IMF agreement. Edgar Lungu's administration, 2015 to 2021, struggled with IMF negotiations due to its reluctance to implement reforms, contributing to Zambia's debt default in 2020. The Hichilema administration's success in securing the IMF deal in 2022 was framed as a correction of these past failures, creating political tensions with Lungu's Patriotic Front (PF). Following Lungu's death, his family, including Esther Lungu, expressed distrust toward President Hakainde Hichilema's government, particularly over funeral arrangements. Lungu reportedly left instructions that Hichilema should not be anywhere near his body, reflecting deep personal and political animosity. Lafrica.com. Chatham House, BBC.com. Esther Lungu's emotional response, while not explicitly tied to the IMF deal in available sources, can be inferred to align with the PF's broader critique of Hichilema's policies, including the IMF agreement. The PF and Lungu's supporters have criticized the deal's austerity measures, such as subsidy cuts, which they argue burden ordinary Zambians. Zambians. Esther Lungu's public statements, as conveyed through family spokesman Makebi Zulu, emphasize respecting Lungu's legacy and wishes, suggesting a rejection of Hichilema's governance, which includes the IMF-backed reforms. Her response likely reflects grief over her husband's death, frustration with the political marginalization of the PF, and concern about the socio-economic impacts of the IMF deal on Zambia's vulnerable populations. BBC.com. Makebi Zulu raises legal red flags. Makebi Zulu, a prominent Zambian lawyer and spokesman for the Lungu family, has raised concerns about the IMF deal, though specific legal objections are not detailed in the provided sources. As a constitutional lawyer and PF affiliate, Zulu's critiques likely focus on the legal and governance implications of the IMF's conditions. Potential red flags include sovereignty and legislative overreach. Zulu may argue that the IMF's mandated reforms, such as the Public Debt Management Act and Bank of Zambia Act revisions, encroach on Zambia's legislative sovereignty by aligning national laws with external priorities. These changes, while aimed at enhancing transparency, could be seen as limiting parliamentary oversight and government autonomy. CommonwealthLawyers.com. Social impact of austerity. The IMF's fiscal consolidation measures, including subsidy cuts and FISP reforms, could be challenged as legally problematic if they violate constitutional protections for social welfare or exacerbate poverty, which Zambia's constitution seeks to address. Zulu may highlight the lack of public consultation in implementing these reforms, raising questions about democratic accountability. GCHLWA.blogspot.com. Media and freedom concerns. The opaque drafting of the Zambia Institute of Journalism Bill and new cyber laws, which coincide with IMF-supported governance reforms, has raised alarms about media freedom. Zulu, as a legal advocate, may argue that these laws conflict with constitutional guarantees of free expression, potentially stifling dissent against IMF policies. IFEX.org. Funeral dispute context. Zulu's role in the Lungu funeral dispute underscores his broader critique of the Hichilema administration's governance. He has accused the government of disregarding the Lungu family's wishes, which could extend to a narrative that the IMF deal reflects a pattern of overriding national and public interests. BBC.com. Zulu's legal red flags likely emphasize the need for greater transparency, public participation, and protection of Zambia's constitutional framework in implementing IMF reforms, reflecting broader concerns about external influence and domestic accountability. IMF's history in Africa. A warning? The IMF's history in Africa provides a cautionary backdrop for Zambia's current engagement. Critics argue that decades of IMF interventions have often prioritized creditor interests over African development, with mixed outcomes. Structural adjustment programs, SAPs in the 1980s and 1990s. The IMF's SAPs in Africa enforced austerity, privatization, and trade liberalization, often leading to reduced public spending, increased inequality, and economic dependency. Countries like Ghana and Uganda faced social unrest and weakened public services due to subsidy cuts and wage freezes, raising concerns about similar risks in Zambia. The Tricontinental.org. Debt traps. The IMF's loans, while providing short-term relief, have historically locked African nations into debt cycles. Zambia's current high risk of debt distress, despite restructuring efforts, echoes experiences in countries like Kenya, where IMF programs have increased debt servicing burdens. The Tricontinental.org. Sovereignty erosion. The IMF's conditionalities have often limited African governments' policy autonomy. For example, Ghana's central bank lost significant control after a 1966 IMF intervention post-Nkrumah coup. Zambia's mandated reforms, such as subsidy cuts and FISP reductions, raise similar concerns about external control over national priorities. The Tricontinental or GCHLWA.blogspot.com. Mixed reform outcomes. While the IMF claims to have reformed since the SAP era, emphasizing social spending and governance, critics like Grieve Chelwa argue that its Zambia program retains heartless elements such as drastic spending cuts and minimal increases in social cash transfers from K90 to K110 monthly. The IMF's praise for Zambia's maize self-sufficiency while demanding FISP cuts highlights contradictions in its approach. GCHLWA.blogspot.com. GCHLWA.blogspot.com. Neo-colonial critiques. Organizations like Tricontinental argue that IMF programs reinforce neo-colonial dynamics by prioritizing creditor repayment over African development. Zambia's reliance on the G20 Common Framework and negotiations with creditors like China and Eurobond holders underscores this dependency. The Tricontinental.org. This history suggests that Zambia must approach the IMF deal cautiously, balancing immediate financial needs with long-term sovereignty and social equity. The risk of repeating past mistakes, such as austerity-driven inequality, serves as a warning for policymakers and civil society. Zambians react on social media. Social media reactions to the IMF deal, while not extensively documented in the provided sources, can be inferred from Zambia's polarized political and economic climate. Platforms like X likely reflect a range of sentiments. Support for reforms. Supporters of President Hichilema and the United Party for National Development (UPND) may view the IMF deal as a necessary step to restore economic stability after the PF's mismanagement. Posts might highlight the Eurobond restructuring and increased social spending as positive outcomes, aligning with the government's narrative of a new dawn. Chathamhouse.org. Criticism of austerity. PF supporters and critics like Grieve Chelwa likely use social media to decry the deal's austerity measures, such as subsidy cuts and FISP reforms, which increase living costs for ordinary Zambians. Hashtags like hashtag IMF austerity or hashtag Zambia debt could amplify concerns about food insecurity and poverty. gcachelwa.blogspot.com. Sovereignty concerns. Activists and civil society groups may express fears about loss of sovereignty, echoing critiques of neo-colonialism. Social media campaigns might draw parallels with historical IMF failures in Africa, urging greater public oversight. The tricontinental.org. Drought and economic hardship. The 2024 drought, which worsened economic conditions, likely dominates discussions, with users blaming both the IMF's stringent conditions and government policies for inadequate relief measures. Calls for expanded social cash transfers or drought aid may trend. IMF.org. Political polarization. The Lungu funeral dispute, amplified by Makebi Zulu statements, suggests that social media is a battleground for political rivalries. PF supporters may frame the IMF deal as a betrayal of Lungu's legacy, while UPND supporters defend it as pragmatic. BBC.com. These reactions highlight a divided public, with the IMF deal serving as a lightning rod for broader debates about governance, economic policy, and national identity. What's next for Zambia? Zambia's path forward under the IMF program involves navigating economic recovery, drought-related challenges, and political tension. Key developments include economic recovery. Growth projections. GDP growth is projected at 6.2% in 2025, driven by mining and agricultural recovery, though risks like global commodity price volatility and power shortages remain. IMF.org. Debt restructuring. Zambia must finalize bilateral agreements with official creditors and reach deals with remaining private creditors by year-end 2025 to ensure debt sustainability. IMF.org. Fiscal consolidation. The 2025 budget will prioritize revenue mobilization and social spending while maintaining austerity, potentially straining public support. IMF.org. Drought response. The government is scaling up social cash transfers, cash for work programs, and school lunch initiatives to address drought-related humanitarian needs, supported by the IMF's augmented funding. However, the adequacy of these measures remains contentious. IMF.org. IMF.org. gcachelwa.blogspot.com. Structural reforms. Accelerating energy sector transparency, public procurement reforms, and anti-corruption measures is critical to unlocking private investment and diversifying the economy. The Bank of Zambia's tight monetary policy aims to curb inflation 15.7% in October 2024 toward the 6 to 8% target by end-2025. IMF.org. Political stability. The 2026 presidential elections loom large, with the IMF deal shaping political discourse. Hichilema's ability to balance reforms with public welfare will determine his re-election prospects, especially amid PF opposition and Lungu's lingering influence. Worldbank.org. Regional and global context. Zambia's diplomatic shift toward Western partners, while maintaining ties with China, will influence its access to investment and aid. Global economic uncertainties, including commodity price fluctuations and geopolitical tensions, add complexity. Chathamhouse.org. IMF.org. Zambia's success hinges on implementing reforms transparently, engaging civil society, and mitigating the social impacts of austerity to maintain public trust. Final thoughts and call to action. The IMF deal offers Zambia a lifeline to address its debt crisis and economic challenges, but comes with significant risks. While the financial support and debt restructuring provide breathing room, the conditions, subsidy cuts, FISP reforms, and fiscal austerity threaten to deepen inequality and undermine sovereignty. The historical context of IMF interventions in Africa underscores the need for vigilance to avoid repeating past mistakes. The tricontinental.org. Call to action. Government. Prioritize transparent communication about the IMF deal's impacts, engage civil society in policy decisions, and ensure social spending adequately protects vulnerable populations. Civil society. Advocate for public oversight of IMF reforms, monitor the effects on small-scale farmers and low-income households, and push for constitutional protections against austerity-driven inequality. Citizens. Use platforms like X to demand accountability, share experiences of economic hardship, and support policies that balance fiscal discipline with social welfare. International community. Support Zambia's drought response and debt restructuring with concessional financing, while respecting its policy autonomy to foster sustainable development. Zambia stands at a crossroads. By critically engaging with the IMF program and prioritizing inclusive growth, it can chart a path toward resilience and prosperity, but only if all stakeholders work together to safeguard the nation's interests.